Welcome back. The United States and China are the world's two largest economies. Their markets and manufacturing sectors are dependent on each other, yet their economic systems are very different. China has adopted a novel system it calls a socialist market economy. It's a mixture of government-owned industries and a free market. That model has catapulted the country to the world's second biggest economy in a relatively short amount of time. And it has also seen major social benefits. China has lifted at least 500 million people out of poverty, and half of its population now lives in urban centers. In contrast, the world's biggest economy, the United States, has the highest economic disparity in the Western world. The top 1% now controls more than 40% of the nation's wealth, while the bottom 80% owns just 7%. So the question we're asking our panel, is China doing capitalism better than the United States? I'm now joined from Connecticut by Peter Schiff, who heads Euro Pacific Capital, a U.S. brokerage firm. He's also a radio host and author, and his latest book has sort of a gloomy title, America's Coming Bankruptcy, The Real Crash, How to Save Yourself and Your Country. We'll talk to him a little bit about that. Also with me here in the studio, Fred Smith. He's the president and founder of Competitive Enterprise Institute. It's a Washington, D.C. based think tank that focuses on the principles of limited government, free enterprise, and individual liberty. I want to welcome both of you to the show. Peter, let me start with you. I was having lunch recently with a gentleman who does business both here in the United States and China. And I posed this question to him, and I said, why is there a difference? And he said, because the Chinese don't take capitalism for granted. Is that a safe way of describing it?
Well, I think a better way to phrase your underlying question is, does America do capitalism worse than China? Now, you mentioned that China is succeeding with this some kind of combination of free market capitalism and central planning with some government-owned industries. The reason that China is succeeding is not because of government involvement. China is succeeding despite that. It's just that there's enough capitalism in China to overcome all these government obstacles. The problem is there's a lot of central planning in America as well, and I would argue that there's more in America, that we have more distortion of the market based on our government meddling through the tax code, with guaranteed loans, with the Federal Reserve, with various subsidies. I think we are doing more damage to capitalism in America than China is in China, and the results speak for themselves. Look at the enormous surpluses that the Chinese are accumulating. We run up these huge deficits, and I would disagree. You described it as a symbiotic relationship where we both benefit. I think right now it's more like a parasite and a host, where we're feeding off the Chinese economy. They're suffering because they're sending us all these goods that we can't pay for. They give us real stuff that we can use, and we give them dollars that they can't use.
Okay, Peter, let me stop you there, because I want to give Fred a chance to jump in here for just a second. Hold on for just a second. Fred, I want to give you a chance to respond.
One of my staffers points out that you don't have to teach the grass to grow. Economic growth happens. Entrepreneurship is a natural phenomena, but you just move the rocks off the ground. What has happened in China is they looked over the strait, they saw Hong Kong growing grass, economic growth, and they jackhammered a few holes in that cemented over economy that was totalitarian China, and those holes unleashed enough talent, as Peter points out, to create growth. But there's still massive amounts of rocks on the Chinese lawn, and the question is whether they're going to take them off or not. Right now, they're a mixed economy. They've got all the problems of centralized planning, national industrial policy. You know, we have our roads, our bridges to nowhere. They have their cities with no one living in them. They've basically misdirected massive amounts of capital, and they're going to pay for that, and the Chinese people are going to pay for that.
Let me stop you there, because another distinction one might make about what China is doing differently than the United States. In China, it's value. They look at value. In the United States, it seems like we look at vapor. So many people are working the market, trying to short things. It's not real value, and they're trying to make money in a hurry. And isn't that one of the problems, Peter? I mean, we talk about derivatives. We talk about all the problems the United States has gotten into. And this is really the crux of it, isn't it?
Well, no, the crux of it is we used to have a real capitalist economy back in the 19th century, and we still had a lot left in the early part of the 20th century. But we began to basically go down the wrong path during the progressive era around the turn of 1900, and then we went to Roosevelt with the New Deal, then the Fair Deal under Johnson, and now what we've got now is we no longer have a free market. We've got this phony economy with government directing all the capital to education, to health care, to services. Nobody is saving because the Fed's got interest rates at zero. Everybody is in debt. We've got a huge bloated government on the federal level and also on the individual state level. So we've got this economy that isn't really sustainable. We depend on foreign capital and foreign production. And China's problem is they've kind of...
Peter, give Fred a chance to jump in here for just a second.
You've got a gloomy story, and God knows there's a lot to be sorry about in the way America is misdirected. The progressive era, of course, was the fatal flaw that led us on the wrong track. But nonetheless, China has about 40% of its economy not in crony capitalism, but actually owned by government. It still has a high degree of centralized control. It has the fact that entrepreneurship is still harder there. As bad as the regulatory structure, you didn't mention regulations, which is the way the U.S. economy is controlled. We don't have crony capitalism and regulation are the real problems in America, and we're still an entrepreneurial society, more than any other in the world. You've got to go through a minefield in America to be a successful entrepreneur, but in China you've got to get the permission of the bureaucrats. It's still easier to be an entrepreneur in America, God knows, far harder than it should be, but don't underestimate the fact that we could still turn this country around. China has got a lot of transitional problems.
Well, I would argue, though, I think it's harder in America to start from scratch than in China. I think we have a higher raise of regulations. I just know in my own business right now, I own a brokerage firm. It is impossible. There is no way I could ever start that firm today the way I did myself in the 1990s, because the barriers to entry are now so high. The government-imposed compliance costs, it's impossible for a young person to repeat what I did. But I think it might be easier to do something like that in China. It's certainly a lot easier in Hong Kong, which is still part of China.
Yes, Hong Kong is the example of all of us, but it's a city-state, and it certainly has helped China to come to its senses, and maybe it'll help us come to our senses. But look, as bad as the barriers to entry are, and government continuously, when an entrepreneurial field opens up, the regulators finally rush in, try to close it down. But America so far has found entree points, parts of the frontier that have not been closed down. And that's why the vaporware you talked about earlier, that's why the nanotech, biotech fields haven't been destroyed in America. They've been weakened, they've been slowed, but we're still creating wealth in the new fields. The challenge is, can we recognize that grass will wither and die
it's
unless
being
we
dwarfed
get out
by
of the
the
way.
liabilities. We're running $600 billion a year trade deficits. I mean, walk into a store, go into Walmart, find something that was made in America. Everything is made in China in those stores.
No,
how can we be more competitive? How can it be easier to start businesses here when they're eating our lunch?
Peter, you're smart enough to know that this fetish for the dying industries of the past, agriculture, we've left that. Manufacturing, we've left that. Service, we're leaving. We've got a whole... The creative destruction is about continuously moving to the part of the world that has not yet been closed down. And that's why we see so much creativity in America, because bureaucrats are not smart enough to close down the future. They try. But we still have a society that does it. We don't have to get a Politburo's approval before we try something new. And all of the things that we disparage, the service industry, the vaporware industries you put, are the ways wealth is being created in the modern world, and they're being created here, not in China.
Peter, let me give you a chance to respond. What's your view?
What's happening in American manufacturing is not creative destruction. It's just destruction. If you go back to the Industrial Revolution, when we became a manufacturing economy, we didn't destroy our farms. The farms just became so productive that we could feed all the people working in manufacturing. In fact, we can export. We didn't start importing our food from Europe because we had manufacturing. What we've done now is destroy our manufacturing sector, and we now import all the things that we used to make ourselves, while millions of Americans are unemployed. This is pure destruction, and it's because of big government policies. The government has made it too expensive to hire Americans with all the rules and regulations and taxes, and the Federal Reserve has destroyed our capital by keeping interest rates so low. Meanwhile, we're borrowing all this money from China. You talk about these ghost towns that the Chinese have built these cities. The stupidest thing they did is buy treasury bonds. They got a lot more treasuries to worry about than cities. And if they stop buying all those treasuries and let their own currency rise, then citizens would have plenty of purchasing power to move into those ghost towns.
Peter, yes, of course, but you overstate your case. Look, we're all aware, we agree about a lot of the problems America has, but manufacturing didn't disappear. We outsourced a lot of the components of it in a global economy. The Chinese have much more trouble doing that outsourcing because they're more of a closed economy. The challenge we face as societies.
But we have a $600 billion a year trade deficit.
So what?
$600 billion a year trade deficit. We are drowning in red ink. What's going to happen when interest rates rise in America and we can't service this debt?
Peter, trade deficits are not taken seriously by any serious scholar, and you know better than that. I mean, it's just like one of those shibboleths. It's a shibboleth people throw out of there.
Guys, time out for just a second. Let me ask another quick question. You know, China is the world's largest creditor nation, and the U.S. has the world's largest debt.
Right.
It appears to me China is doing something right. I mean, would you give it that, Fred?
I think China's doing a lot right. The real challenge is how do we make China as good as it could be. We would be great if China dwarfed what they're doing now. We would be better if China were 10 times richer than they are now. And the trouble is the Chinese have internal problems they've got to face. We have internal problems we have to face. We can't solve China's problems for them, and God knows they can't solve our problems for them, but both of us can do better. Milton Friedman, we're both trapped in a national industrial policy. We're both trapped in a situation where government's too big. But government's bigger there still. It's getting smaller.
Let me give Peter a chance to jump in here then.
Yeah, we are living off of China's productivity right now. The way that China would get richer is to stop buying dollars, stop buying treasuries, and let their own currency rise. That would bring down prices in China. That would lift the standard of living of everybody living in China. But what would that do in America? That would send consumer prices through the roof. That would send interest rates soaring, and we would be in the same position as Greece.
Well, look, should China have a different monetary policy? You know, what is that? One person in a million understands monetary policy, and I meet him every time I take a cab across town. The real challenge is that China will undoubtedly do some of that. They've slowed that down, as you know, because they're worried. They've got a mercantilistic policy like we do. We both want to export and not import anything. That's silly. We benefit, well, trade is mutually
the only reason you export is to import. You export to pay for your imports. The key is to increase your standard of living by having more consumer goods for your citizens. See, America, we're dependent on all the goods that we import on credit because we're not producing enough. And we're not saving enough, which is why we don't have the capital to produce.
Well, you know what, Peter? I wish I could save more time for this discussion, but unfortunately we've run out of time. Peter, can't thank you enough for joining us. You've had a lot of interesting insights. Fred, it's great getting your take on things as well.
Thanks,
Certainly
Peter.
appreciate it.